Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, we are honored to host Mohamed Abdou. We'll be talking a little bit about his book, which is behind me there, Islam and Anarchism. And of course, we'll also talk about, some of the circumstances, obviously, that bring us together. I mean, one, obviously, just want to, of course, as always, ground these conversations in Palestine, in Gaza, in Rafah, and in the reasons that have kind of brought together a whole bunch of the conversations that we've had since October 7th, um, and this one as well, right? And so, Mohammed is someone who has faced a lot, and we'll get into that, right? But in particular, one of the recent kind of flashpoints was that even in front of Congress, there was a congressperson who, I guess called him out, wanted him, insurances that he would be fired, etc., right? And President of Colombia, Minouche Shafik, said something to the effect of he will never work here again, right? And so we'll get into that. We'll get into the details of that, but this is going to be a larger ranging conversation, not just a conversation about repression, but also a conversation about his scholarly work. Hopefully, a conversation also about the Columbia encampment and encampments in New York. I know he hasn't just been at the Columbia one, and his own organizing background. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I do want to say one other thing. There is in the show notes, and I just added this, a a piece that was put out by Pluto Press, which his book Islam and Anarchism is a Pluto Press book. It also it's about him and Jodi Dean, right? And there's actions people can take related to both of them. Jodi Dean has been on the show, at least the audio side, once before, along with Sharice Burden-Stelly, to talk about their work on Black communist women. And so I encourage people to please, take a few minutes and support both of those scholars. Also, um, you know, just there's many scholars, and hopefully we can talk about some of the others too and lift them up, that are facing repression. And I think there's an importance to acknowledge that there's already obviously been this kind of attack on academia, but specifically on radical academics over the last several years, and that this is being heightened in this moment, and that Palestine is a kind of red line in this country, and it's something that's being used in particular by the far right, by Zionist forces, right, to attack academics who embrace revolutionary politics, who embrace transnationalism or internationalism, who embrace decolonization, right? And so Muhammad, his work obviously crosses through all of those intersections and more, as I'm sure we will get into today. So anyway, take a minute, of course, do the basic things, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and invite other people into the conversation. Welcome everybody joining us this morning. It's great to see you all. Hopefully we'll also have some time for a few audience questions if people have questions as well. I don't want this just to be a conversation where I keep all of the discussion. And so I'm gonna say, so hang on one second. So I just wanted to say quickly, by way of introduction, that Mohamed Abdou has been the Arcapita visiting assistant professor in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies at Columbia University during this semester. He's a former assistant professor of sociology in the American University of Cairo, and more, also the author of Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances. So I'm going to welcome Mohammed to the stage, and also offer you space, Dr. Abdou, to say more by way of introduction.
First of all, Assalamu alaikum, Jared, and to the listeners. Shalom alakhayim to my Jewish siblings. I usually start on my talks in the same format, somewhat, to not to sound repetitive like a broken record or pedantic. But because we need to put nuqat al-huruf, we need to put the dots on the letters, given the context of the conversation. I'm very humbled to be with you, Jared, and to be on the show. Musa in the Quran is quoted as saying as he's about to meet Pharaoh, accompanied by his brother Aaron. Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma shrah li sadri, O Creator, may you open thy breast, wa yassir li amri, and make my affairs easy. Wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli, and undo the knot on my tongue such that what it is that I have to ostensibly share with you all becomes accessible. And it would behoove me if I did not also note the fact that I'm standing on Lenape and Lenape territory. I'm a North African settler of color, family members that lived in Gaza. And I'm an intellectual organizer, as you noted, Jared. I'm currently an assistant professor, or visiting assistant professor at Columbia University. Formerly before that, I was at, as a visiting scholar, Zionist land grab Cornell, and that's not being facetious. Cornell is the largest land grab university, over 1 million acres of stolen land, displacement over 250, at least, indigenous nations, as well as its collaboration insofar as Zionist occupation of Palestine vis-a-vis investments in companies as Technion, a paramilitary, or extension of Israel's paramilitary industrial complex. As you noted, I'm also, or was, an assistant professor at the American University of Cairo. And before that, I taught at the University of Toronto. Indigenous Land Education and Black Geography is a course that was offered, in a certain sense, to me, at least for one semester, by Dr. Eve Tuck, author of Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, her and Wen Yang. And I've taught at Queen's University. Before that, I was an engineer. My involvement is post insofar as organizing the anti-globalization movements of Seattle. As well, I lived 45 minutes away from Mohawk Reserves, and I was involved in indigenous land defending with the sister territories of Akwesasne and Kanasatake, over the Copperstone land dispute, the anti-war organizing, obviously with regards to Iraq and Afghanistan. Zapatistas lived 2 uprisings as far as 2011 and 2013 in the context of Egypt, the Tahrir uprisings. Though my views with regards to 2013, we could sit down and talk about them. I was actually against the uprisings of 2013 for lots of different reasons, and abolition and so on and so forth, movements in the context of Turtle Island. And like I said, I have the honor of dancing with you today, tangoing with you today, playing fire with you today, and yeah, let's just leave it at that. Let's just leave it at that. So.
Well, welcome, and I look forward to this conversation. It's great to be in conversation with you. It's good to be with you today. So I want to start actually with some of your work. So one of the things I really appreciate within your book, Islam and Anarchism, is the study of the Quran and some of the radical politics that you see embedded within it. As you describe them as kind of anti-authoritarian, anti-state, open to affinities between both believers and non-believers. You talk of, and please correct my pronunciation on these if I falter, but the concept of shura and greater jihad. So can you say a little bit about these concepts and also a bit about the larger body of Islamic scripture and practice that you draw on in elaborating what you refer to as Anarcha-Islām?
So very briefly, Anarcha-Islām is an Islamic interpretation reading of anarchism, an anarchistic reading of the Quran. And primarily I rely on the Quran specifically, and this is not to the neglect of the oral tradition, the ahadith, or what is referred to as the hadith, as well as the prophetic practice insofar as the sunnah. generally speaking. But rather, the Quran is the one barometer, the one caliber by which all Muslims are ultimately accountable. Insofar as whether you belong to the Nation of Islam, whether you're a Sunni, a Shiite, an Ismaili, an Ahmadi, a Sufi, and so on and so forth, right? And while there's discrepancy and differences of opinion over the hadith or ilm al-hadith, the science of oral traditions, and so on and so forth, the Quran, and not to the neglect of hadith, is really the measuring yardstick that I use. Now, when I refer to anarchism, I'm not referring to Eurocentric interpretations of it that emerged late 19th century, 20th century, right? I don't really care what you call this interpretation. You can call it Islamatismo for all I care about. Ultimately, it is Islam. And Islam is not a monolith, just as anarchisms are not a monolith. No idea is a monolith. But then we need to talk about the violence of translation or the politics of translation, because often Islam is mistranslated as submission by Orientalists as well as Muslims themselves. Well, if you translate the word submission into Arabic, it means khudu', or it gives you the word khudu', right, which is a completely different concept than Islam, different word. Islam actually comes from the root salama, to willfully deliver, 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form salama, sin lam mim, to willfully deliver, to deliver upon choice. And of course, it's mistranslated as submission to give the illusion that Muslims simply acquiesce to what it is that they're indoctrinated with, right? Despite the fact that the Quran always uses terms as أَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَلَا يَعْلَمُونَ أَلَا يَفْقَهُونَ, do they not think, do they not reflect, do they not engage, or engage in the greater, or if you will, ijtihad, right? Which is the right of every Muslim to engage in critical reasoning insofar as the Quran. There are more blank spaces on a page than what's written in black. There are verses in the Quran that nobody knows the meaning of. Chapter of the cow, begins with Alif Lam Mim, 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word that nobody knows the meaning of. But similarly, anarchism is often mistranslated as chaos, as anarchy, right? Despite this, Rauf Izzat, who is a political scientist at the University of Cairo, had corrected this translation insofar as Arabic is La Sultawiyya, which means without authority, without leaders. Now, that said, we are then contending with words that have been placed on our tongues that we don't know the meaning of: fascism, totalitarianism, Islam, anarchism, and so on and so forth, right? And we need to sit down and talk about the Orwellian moment in which we live, right? First, they steal the words and then they steal the meanings, and the catastrophe of liberalism is the very bosom of white supremacy and enlightenment politics, right? And identity politics and so on, right? So this becomes the idea of the grander book. What is it that connects, if you will, and we'll talk about this, 1492, with, insofar as the broader paradigm and the framing of spirituality, of no Dakota pipelines, insofar as protests, insofar as the Black Spring, as Robin D.J. Kelly refers to it, insofar as Tahrir, insofar as Occupy, although we should be questioning what are we really occupying when we're talking about stolen land, right? Let alone the moment insofar as that we're witnessing, that we're living, insofar as Palestine. Now, Anarcha-Islām, I continued it, or Islam and Anarchism, emerged out of also, and I need to say this, my work on Islam and queer Muslims that took me 10 years. That was my PhD. And it was ethnographic, it was historical-archival. I did archival research at Al-Azhar University, the most preeminent institution or Islamic institution that arguably exists in the world. But it also involved ethnographic research with queer Black and non-Black Muslims in the context of Egypt at the very height of the so-called Arab Spring, another Orientalized term. It included queer Nubian Egyptians, queer Sudanese Egyptians, trans-sex workers, gay men in the Egyptian military, as well as queer Black and non-Black Muslims in the context of Turtle Island, the settler-colonial context of the US and Canada, in order to understand the circulatory dynamics of Islam, queerness, gender, and the weaponization of gender and queerness as imperial modes of conquest, vis-a-vis homo-nationalism, pinkwashing, and the reactions or the reactionary politics that solicits from conservative institutions, movements, dictatorships, or religious, and at the same time from liberal progressive perspectives, where here were queer narratives insofar as Muslims. Now, this radical interpretation of Islam is one that transcends, like I said, the conservative arc of Muslims that tend to be queerophobic, that tend to be against CRT, critical race theory, that are against feminisms, broadly speaking. And at the same time, it resituates where here recur narratives, feminist politics that are embraced or tend to be embraced by Muslim feminists, particularly in Euro-America, as a project or as an extension of the project of progressive politics that assimilates into the settler-colonial state, right? That we want queer rights, that we want queer freedoms, and so on and so forth. Now, insofar as addressing the concepts that you brought up, that becomes very important because the goal of the book is to take political theology very seriously and spiritual leftist traditions. When we're talking about Nkrumah, when we're talking about Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, when we're talking about Walter Rodney, even Kwame Ture said that our people have never seen religion as the opium of the masses. That, of course, comes directly out of European culture. For Africans, for people of color, for the global South, religion and revolution go hand in hand. If one is truly religious, one must be revolutionary. So the inanities called astounding, this buying into the secular discourse that is informed by a Christian ethos, when we have figurations and figures, ancestors as Nat Turner, as Malcolm, as Martin Luther King, as Tolstoy, as Ali Shariati, as Dorothy Day, Jack Ellul, Abu Dar al-Jafari, just to name a few. There, and yet we see this reinstantiation of no, we need to maintain a certain secularism because most of our movements are informed, or leftist movements tend to be informed by sort of a white animus that has abject relationships with Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, hierarchical formations, despite the fact that Christianity is an Eastern discourse, right? So I'm really piercing at what Anyunte, building on the word of Edward Glosson, of Frantz Fanon, César, Sylvia Wynter, Enrique de Sel, had referred to insofar as secularism being a colonial crusading construct. Alberto Toscano similarly had written and discussed how secularism, the constant reiteration of secularism in a certain sense, is the key stake of the current religious and political crisis. It's this hard-won result of the history of Christendom, which can allegedly explain both the civilizational subalternity of predominantly Muslim societies, as well as its collective rage. Now, that means that I'm going back to, like I said, to the Quran, to sit down and search through ijtihad, the use of critical reasoning, what are the forms of governance that Islam extols? Now, you mentioned a couple, right? Given the fact that there's a concept of shura, of mutual consultation, there's a chapter actually called the chapter of mutual consultation, and the concept of the greater jihad, or jihad. The greater jihad is the jihad and the struggle against the microfascisms of the self. And I know we're going to be talking about that, in a little bit, right? But to look at what does Islam say insofar as its own governing, its own economic models. Now, most people would sit down and argue, well, Islam is anti-capitalist. Now, being anti-anything is wonderful, but that's a rhetorical slogan, if you will. What are the non-capitalist, non-authoritarian concepts that inform this anarchistic, anti-authoritarian, or non-authoritarian and non-capitalist interpretation of Islam, one that is queer feminist, that is anti-classist, that is anti-ableist, and so on and so forth, right? Tawheed is the central concept or pillar of Islam, insofar as when one becomes a Muslim, reverts, converts, we could sit down and talk about the difference between those two, or lack of difference. To Islam, the first thing they do is engage in Aqidat Tawheed, which is the pledge of allegiance to the sovereignty of Creator and nobody but Creator. So you don't worship a tribe, family, a nation, your blood, your kin, nothing but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the single and sole manifestation of sovereignty that one pledges allegiance to. And the ethical, political, spiritual commitments that inform what that sovereign then commands, if you will, us and our species as khulafa, as caretakers of one another, to live by, insofar as each other, as believers, as well as in relationship to non-human life. Now, the word Muslim or Muslimin is used only 5 or 6 times in the Quran. The emphasis is on the category of mu'minin, right, which is believers. And so part of the work is tracing what are the characteristics that inform believers and so-called non-believers or kuffar. And one begins to discover through my own work that the believer is the one that mines the rights of the orphans, the poor, women, children, the elderly, does not create or incept israf, does not corrupt in the earth, does not engage in waste. I shudder to think that there are so many chapters in the Quran that are named after non-human life. The chapter of the bees, the chapter Surah Al-Nahl, Surah Al-Qamar, Surah Al-Naml, Surah Al-Fil, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of the sun, the chapter of the elephant, the chapter of the thunder, and so on and so forth. One can go on for quite a fair bit. Muslims don't reflect on our responsibilities to non-human life, our Mother Earth, who is a subject and not an object. Right? She produces the very air that we breathe, the very thamarat, the very seeds that sprout into fruits and vegetables that we consume, that we necessitate for our own thriving, if not surviving. So Tawheed is one of those anti and non-authoritarian concepts that I don't pledge allegiance, because states require us to pledge allegiance to it. We're going to pledge allegiance to this Euro-American state in which we will combat and fight all enemies, foreign and domestic, right? And so the state has its own religion that people worship, insofar as the flag. Capitalism has its own relationship. It is its own religion insofar as the 9-to-5 jobs, right? The in God we trust on the dollar bill, and so on and so forth. Now, the manifestation of sovereignty and so on also exists insofar as, at least as embodied over here, because there is no concept as the Islamic State. Even ISIS makes this mistake that al-Dawla al-Islamiyya. Arabs didn't have a word for dawla, and so we took a word that means the opposite of the state to denote the state, and that is the word dawla. Dawla actually comes from the verb or the Quranic term duwayla, which falls between two verbs, to rotate and to go away, dar and zal, but we didn't have a word for state. So you ask Muslims or Arabs, well, is there a word for state? And they'll say dawla, and they're mistaken in that, just as much as, like I said, Islam is mistranslated as submission. But the manifestation then of sovereignty in this world is in the concept of the ummah. The ummah is this pluriverse concept that is not territorial, that includes believers alike. And it's centered around the charter, which is referred to as Mithaq al-Medina, the Medina Charter that the Prophet founded, that included Muslims, Sabians, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and so on, that were united in the shared ethical, spiritual, political commitments that bound them together. And this becomes the idea that pierces through again and transcends liberal identity politics, because it doesn't matter to me if you come and define yourself as a Muslim or as a Jew or as queer. You could be Muslim and Zionist, and there are plenty of those nowadays. There could be Muslim and queer-phobic and so on. So that doesn't make you a part of my ummah, if you will, and that global polity that transcends, if you will, geographic boundaries, particularly nation states in a post-Westphalian world. Sykes-Picot, and so on and so forth. I mean, we live in a world of capitalist nation states, and all states are capitalist to one degree or another. So this is about also transcending cultures of whiteness that we all internalized. We have to understand that whiteness is not just a phenotype that way, but a modality, because we have black, red, brown-skinned folks with white masks. And this is what becomes key. How do we then embody new forms of symbiotic relations, not only towards one another in terms of our species as khulafa, again, another non-capitalist word, non-authoritarian term, because we're all caretakers of the land. So even Muslims, will hearken on this idea of the caliphate, but the caliphate is a non-binding governing model that emerged way after the Prophet, peace be upon him, died. And in a certain sense, it emerges out of the concept of khulafa, which is we're all caretakers, so there's no need for a singular caliph or a singular caliphate. The Ummah normally and traditionally was a confederacy, if you will, that included various duwaylat, circulatory sort of centers, decentralized centers of power that manifested everywhere throughout sort of predominantly Muslim societies. And that becomes key. Another concept is mijma', which is mutual consultation. Maslaha, public welfare, and of course you mentioned the greater jihad, the struggle, or al-jihad al-akbar, the greater struggle against one's inner microfascisms. I've been socialized by patriarchal, matriarchal, class privileges, etc., right? And my responsibility individually and collectively is to combat those privileges within an environment that hopefully encourages a return to an indigeneity, a state of fitra, what in Islam is the nascent condition in which we're all born into, to connect with non-human life, to connect with one another, and that umbilical cord that we're severed from. You know, when I was a wee within my mother's womb, if you will, right? So that becomes the idea, and it'll stop there, and then I'm sure we'll expand upon these discussion points.
Very much appreciated. I also just wanted to, as you were talking about, the point around the secular and the left, like this is something that is always something that's very interesting to me. I also um, have been inspired by Sylvia Wynter's work, which I think does a great job of exposing that the secular is a story. It's a narrative that, as you say, comes out of the Euro-Christian tradition, right?
Mhm.
Um, and also just thinking about left-wing movements in the United States that I have drawn inspiration from. We could talk about Sekou Odinga, rest in power, Dhoruba Ben Wahad,
Mhm.
and then Mumia Abu Jamal and Jamil Al-Amin as the last two, obviously, folks that still we need to free from behind the walls.
Mhm.
Um, all Muslims, all folks who converted to Islam, as they also have been engaged in militant anti-colonial, decolonial practice. So yeah, I think that I just wanted to underscore that I think that has been um it is a problem. It is an ongoing problem within the left, this antagonism, I think, toward people of faith, even if you're not one yourself, and
Mhm.
this emphasis on the secular. So just
Mhm.
appreciate that. Um, so continuing on, you mentioned Eve Tuck earlier on, and K. Wayne Wong in writing. This is a quote that you use as a, is it an epigraph? I think is the term, a guide quote to one of your chapters. Um, the quote is, "Settler colonialism fuels imperialism all around the globe. Oil is the motor and motive for war, and so was salt, and so will be water. Settler sovereignty over the very pieces of earth, air, and water is what makes possible these imperialisms," end quote. And so you go on to talk also about, in this section, about fascism as mass psychology.
Mhm.
Um, so can you say a little bit about these material and psychological architectures of settler colonialism, of fascism, and this inextricable link to imperialism in your perspective?
Thank you. To pick up on what we were discussing, Jared, and this is something that the book identifies as well. There's a difference between the concept of religion, deen, in Islam, loosely the word deen, if you will. That's the Arabic sort of term that's often used to describe religion, versus faith, iman, which is where the term mu'minin comes from, believers, and ruhaniya, spirituality, and hierarchical interpretations, authoritarian interpretations, given the fact that in the context of Islam and Judaism, because I've done study and teach on Jewish studies as well as Islamic studies and many other different interdisciplinary studies. But there's a difference and interrelation between these various different concepts, right? And there is no central church within Islam or within Judaism, right? A rabbi is not a priest, and so on and so forth. So, and neither is an imam, and that's an often sort of problematic term within itself. But again, the book discusses all that and a lot more. But the importance of cosmology in the sense of cosmovisions that historical materialism can't necessarily or doesn't necessarily allow room for. And this is within anarchist or even traditional European Marxist reading and anarchist readings. But the reason that settler colonialism then becomes very important is because settler colonialism is a religious structure. As Patrick Wolf had noted, settler colonialism, 1492, which I know we'll get to in a bit, is a structure, an instituted structure, and isn't an event. Um, Again, the earth is not an anthropomorphized object. It is not property, and certainly not within the context of Islam, because in Islam, al-mulk lillah, all things belong to, all subjects belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Settler colonialism, and again, it is one manifestation of the nation state, post-colonial states or another, organize and a difference and hierarchize society insofar as the world of the above and the world of the below. And what do I mean by that? Power is fluid right here, right now, between you and I. You could walk away from this conversation, you could shut it down. There are asymmetrical power relations between us. What the state does is that it crystallizes these relationships in hierarchical forms, right, to solicit a kind of obedience, right, as kind of submission. The state is not this abstract entity that exists over and above us, but rather we already govern one another vis-a-vis the set of capillary relations that we have internalized vis-a-vis these governing models. The state, if you will, from a psychological perspective, and here again, now we're going to go back to the nuance of terms. When people sit down and say, well, Trump is a fascist, Trump wasn't trying to become a fascist, he was trying to become a totalitarian, like Putin, like Kim Jong-un, and so on and so forth, right? And there's a difference, again, if we want to read, if we want to really be meticulous about language, we should sit down and read, perhaps Deleuze and Guattari, Saul Newman, and William Reich, William Reich had written The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And in the context of Nazism, and certainly he was a Nazi as well, but there are things to learn insofar as the psychology and the mass psychology of fascism that way, right? That how do people, are they conditioned to covet and solicit their own submission and their own acquiescence towards injustice and to be elementally manipulated in that sense? And we could sit down and read Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism to understand, again, the difference between those two terms. But the nation state acts as our Oedipal father. Like I said, it teaches how to govern, how to discipline ourselves and everything that is around us. Oh, you're not Black, you must be Indigenous. You're not Indigenous, you must be a person of color, as if these liberal identity politics encapsulate these compartmentalized formations are sufficient in terms of our understanding of ourselves, let alone our complicities in each other's struggles, as if there aren't Afro-Indigenous people, as if there aren't Black people of color. Capitalism acts as our Oedipal mother, right? Constructs out of everything an object of utility, if you will. Love, Valentine's Day, Hallmark cards, gay pride surrounded by, gay corporate pride surrounded by Heineken bottles, right? We're here, we're queer narratives, outing ourselves as a white man's way of overcoming our own sense of shame and deflecting from complicities in settler colonialism in the context of here, because that's the history of pride over here, as a lot of queer scholars had written. So queer marriage is not a manifestation of liberty in any way, shape, or form, as Yasmin Nair, Jasper Poor, as Maya Mikdashi, as many, Sarah Schulman, and so on and so forth had written. It actually emulates heteropatriarchy and so on, and it is a conservative cause, ultimately speaking, right? But this is how we become fascists, micro-fascists, complicit in each other's struggles, because we're weaned on, like I said, disciplinary practices, as well as constructing out of everything, even solidarity, which is a verb, an instrument of utility. Look at how indigenous people are tokenized within Palestinian, diasporic, but also Arab and Muslim struggles and so on and so forth, right? And I know we're going to talk about 1492 and its historical, material, spiritual, and symbolic significance too in a bit. But to put things into perspective, people are sitting down and talking about land-backed Palestine, but we're not contending with the monster in the mirror here. It's easy to point at a monster elsewhere. Or what about settler colonialism here? What is settler colonialism? Well, there's an ongoing genocide here, and not just in Palestine, an ongoing genocide that has been taking place for 531 years. Settler colonialism, and to put things into perspective, again, relies on the theft of land and afterlife to slavery projects. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that, just because, so that we're not being superficial. Right? From 100 million strong, indigenous people now constitute 2%, in the context of the US alone, 2% of the total US population, right? And that took a lot of detailed planning, legislation, forced relocation, residential schools, starvation, contaminated smallpox, blankets, bounties on indigenous people's scalps, in a society in which cavalry troops are now slave catchers, right? They've been replaced by police, incarceration, the desecration of reserve land, foster care, the lack of infrastructure, services, poverty as a means and as a tools of ethnic cleansing. And the genocide, hence, continues to this day. And of course, indigenous people continue to be referred to unapologetically. They're deemed as merciless Indian savages in the context of the US Declaration of Independence. And within settler psyches, because settlers, immigrants, diasporas, people of color come and assimilate into the so-called American dream. Well, it's either an American dream or an American nightmare, as Malcolm called it, but this is why this becomes important. And all this is to say nothing with regards to, or little, with regards to Indigenous people's experiences with boarding schools and systems and their lived impacts up until this day. 150-year-old program of separating children from their families, from their lands, which was part of federal policy that continues to be so in order to eradicate Indigenous people, to assign them, as Audra Simpson, to be signposts to history, right? And in order to steal the land. So the US operated and supported more than 408 boarding school institutions in 37 states between 1819 and 1969, and many of which were run by churches. So we're going to go back and talk about, again, the religious dimension and religious organizations. And of course, we're seeing the unearthing of mass graves of children, 500 kids at a time, in marked and unmarked graves. And then we could sit down and talk about the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse that is rampant insofar as Indigenous people, their malnutrition, their overcrowding, the lack of healthcare, the fact that Indigenous children, Indigenous people, were given English names, and they had their hair cut. Like I said, they were forbidden from speaking their own mother tongues and from engaging in their own cultural practices that are tied to land, spiritual practices that are tied to land. And kids who died and continue to die because of abusive relationships, and so on and so forth, right? And the forced assimilation, the cessation of land, the establishment of, new tribal treaties, the ignoring of over 500, 600 treaties with the settler state, the US state. Indigenous people seem to only be remembered when their names are on, football teams like the Washington Redskins and the Chiefs, or weapons of mass destruction are named after them, Tomahawk weapons, Apache helicopters. But that's the first arc of settler colonialism, conquistador settler colonialism, right? Crusading settler colonialism. Because, again, we could sit down and talk about the thousands, over 5,000 missing Indigenous girls and women and so on alone in 2021, right? And Indigenous women are disappearing at a rate that is equal to 2.5 times, if you will, the estimated share of the US population. They're twice as likely to be raped than a white woman. Murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women that is often perpetuated by non-Indigenous people, right? So more than half of Indigenous women have experienced sexual violence that way, right? They represent 2% of police killings and incarcerated at a rate that is 40% higher than the national average. But then we have anti-Black and after-life slavery projects, which is the other arc of settler colonialism here. Right, and what do I mean by that? Slavery is constantly rebirthed, as Dr. Sadi Hartman had noted. Stand your ground laws, police brutality, premeditated extrajudicial killings, routine stop and frisk policies of broken windows, voter disenfranchisement, school to prison nexus and pipelines, impoverishment and premature death, 1994 bills that imperialist Hillary Clinton and Zionist campaign socialist Bernie Sanders had voted for, and that superficially targets Black youth that were referred to as super predators and thugs. So we must acknowledge that representative democracy isn't much of a democracy when it's laden with racialized district remapping, voter disenfranchisement and suppression, partisan gerrymandering, dark money ads, electoral systems, college systems that are pegged against the popular vote, 2010 Citizen United verdicts that give special interests, if you will, and unlimited spending. Bills like 5014C that permit designated social welfare organizations to engage in electoral meddling. So insofar as fascism, we're not individuals, we're networks of relations of power. And settler colonialism, then, again, we either live in a representative, quote unquote, democracy, right? Or we have to find alternative governance models, as we were spiking earlier, right? And the state, or the settler state, any state, operates vis-a-vis a politics of rights, not a politics of responsibility, And so the logic of settler colonialism is to eradicate, to eliminate the native in this ongoing genocide, to engage in anti-Black slavery projects, while at the same time conscripting diasporas into this settler colonial project. So everybody has to hyphenate their American identities, right? The Muslim American, the African American, the Native American, the Asian American, the queer American, the I don't know what American, but the only American that doesn't have to do that is the white American that is assumed to be the native of the land. And that becomes the question, right? Like, America is false to the present, to the future, its ongoing past genocide, its homicidal present, and its suicidal future. And this is what we're discussing. America is leading this war. It is a settler colony. We have to contend with that. There is no freeing Palestine without liberating Turtle Island, right? Israel is but a mere instrument in its arsenal. And so we need to shift the narrative from talking about resistance and Black people and indigenous people of color settling for the scraps that the white man leaves on the dinner table and assimilating into the structure, because again, it's a structure, right? This is what Kwame Ture had noted. Mobilization is one thing. Organization is about learning structures, and we're dealing with a structure. So we need to transition in dealing with structures and understanding the difference between mobilization and organization, and understanding the difference between resistance and anti-colonial resistance and liberation, because anti-colonial resistance is reactionary. It's about talking about surviving or moving beyond surviving, which is reactionary, to talking about thriving. If we fail to understand the scope and the nature of the enemy, we'll succumb in every battle. What are we fighting against and what are we fighting for? Right? But this is part of the indignity of not contending with structures, of wanting to have our cake and eat it too. Oh, look, I'm an American and I'm going to free Palestine. Right? When we have the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs, the destruction of Gazan schools, hospitals, universities, 247 masajid at the very least, 3 churches, 199 heritage sites, right? So this becomes the question. Can we contend as settlers on this land and centering indigenous people? Because again, indigenous people are this add-on unit of analysis, whitewashed intersectional unit of analysis that we composite in essay papers and empty lab acknowledgements. Oh, we're on stolen this and that lab. How are they being centered? How is land back being centered? How is indigenous sovereignty being centered to actually contest, to threaten settler sovereignty, which is what the US is built upon, and to center Black self-determination too? So this becomes the question. Right? My choices will not be as a settler of color between, again, a Zionist Wahhabi crusading alliance on the one hand, and on the other hand, the set of totalitarian regimes that mobilize Islamophobia against the Uyghur or against the Rohingya in the context of Myanmar, against Dalits and Kashmiris in the context of Hindu Tava India, and certainly in the context of Palestine. Like, these are not going to be my choices. So this is what we're talking about here insofar as, are we willing to contend with the monsters in the mirror? Are we willing to take up responsibilities towards indigenous people, towards our Black siblings? Are we willing to get to know one another on the ground, on the streets? And that's hard. That's not easy, because that involves actually developing an ethics of conflict resolution or disagreements, what is known in Islam as usul ikhtilaf. That means investing and breaking bread and getting to know one another insofar as usul al-diyafa and the politics of friendship and hospitality that is between us. The left tears each other apart, right? And this is why we keep on moving from one thing to the other. Oh, Tahrir. Oh, the anti-war protests in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we don't seem to transition again from mobilizing to organizing, where we have right now a bunch of conservative Muslims that, again, are anti-CRT or queerphobic or this and that, right next to queer Muslims, right next to anti-Zionist Jews, right next to anti-religious leftists, right? Based on myopic experiences with Christianity, whitewashed experiences with Christianity, and everybody's yelling free Palestine. What are the conditions, organizational conditions upon which this free Palestine will manifest? And what kind of a free and liberated Palestine? Within 1917, 1948 borders that were contrived by British colonialism and imperialism, because I reject that. So this becomes the question of investing in one another and getting to know one another, which is, and again, we're going to talk about the embodiment of these encampments and so on and so forth. So this is now the key. BDS is great. Blocking ports is great. Shipping, commerce, travel, trade, ruining even a liberal's day is great. But where are the construction of alternatives? And this becomes the question. Revolutions are about practical questions and the construction of alternatives. So this is what it means by contending with the microfascisms of the self and the very situated land, the stolen land, the ongoing genocide that we're living on right here, right now. Because, yeah, there is no liberation of Palestine without here. We're living a fantasy. And we're dealing with a war against, again, we're struggling against not just a bunch of academic Ivy League institutions, but against a settler state.
I mean, I think that should be becoming quite clear to folks, especially too as we see the way that the settler state, the United States in this instance, as people call it, the granddaddy settler or the great Satan or whatever they want to, say, the mechanisms it's willing to use, right, to crush dissent, and also that they understand that also, as you said, you know, um, that decolonization in Palestine is not going to happen without decolonization in Turtle Island. They do understand the existential link, right, between these international settler relationships. I don't want to say affinities because it's much deeper than that. There's a strong material link, of course. So yeah, I appreciate that. So let's talk about 1492 because I know you've done some work about this specifically. I think a lot of us on the left are, well, depending. I mean, on the anti-colonial or decolonial left, I think a lot of us are familiar with, of course, 1492 was a kind of dawn of settler colonialism, Christopher Columbus, etc. But you're looking at more than that. So talk about the significance of 1492 in your work.
Thank you, Jared. So Islam and 1492 are the two elephants in the room. Is I think we're sort of illuminating at this point in time, right? And we're going to get deeper into that insofar as resistance and the muqawma and so on and so forth. And it's not that Islam has been constructed as a quintessential, or it's not that Islam is a quintessential other. It's the way that it's upheld as a quintessential other. It's exceptionalized in certain ways in relationship to 1492. Why is 1492 significant? Because of what happened with regards to Muslims and Jews in the context of Andalusia, in the context of modern-day Spain. Muslims and Jews, as Ila Shuhat, as Salman Sayyid, as a lot of scholars, including myself, had noted, right? Sylvia Winter, and so on and so forth. Muslims and Jews were referred to as savages, savage being the relational descriptor, and heathens being the religious, right? And Muslims and Jews were forcibly converted, were persecuted, were murdered, were raped, were pillaged, were forced, at the hand of the sword. Vis-a-vis Ferdinand and Isabel as a continuation of the ongoing crusade. And the usurpation of Christianity underneath Constantine and its weaponization as a Euro-American imperial mode of conquest. Okay. But something else happened during that year, and that's the Colombian invasion of the Americas. Indigenous people were also referred to as savages and heathens, but it's more than just the racial and the religious descriptor. Like we said, settler colonialism is a religious structure, right? So Columbus, when one reads their diaries, sits down and describes, if you will, the weapons that the Taino people had used against the Crusaders, because Columbus was in a crusading project. He wanted to return back to Christendom. He wanted to, particularly insofar as the context of Palestine, right? And to defeat the Muslims, because again, Muslims were exposed to 3 crusades. And we couldn't be defeated head on, so we needed to be divided and conquered from within. But he had referred to the weapons that the Taino people had used as alfanjis, which is the Spanish term used to describe the scimitars, which is the weapons that Muslims used. Hernan Cortez, the Spanish conquistador, when he described Aztec women, he referred to them as Moorish women. When he described the 400 Aztec temples, he referred to them as Moorish mosques. When he described Montezuma, the Aztec leader, he described him as a sultan. When they described true spirit people, they described them as Verdach, which is the anthropological name, the white supremacist sort of like term that was used to describe gender non-conforming Muslims equally at the same time. How can religion not be a part of this? A third to a fifth of the transatlantic Black siblings that were enslaved were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and the west coast of Africa. How can religion, spirituality not be a part of this conversation? This is not a war between Muslims and Jews, but rather one that Muslims and Jews have been conscripted into, vis-a-vis, again, the white man's usurpation of Christianity, which is an Easter discourse. So even Christianity has been affected by it. And the way that white supremacist reading of Christianity has been imprinted upon Islam in the manifestation of Wahhabism, Muslim Brotherhood thought, as well as Judaism in the manifestation of Zionism, right? And so this becomes the dynamics when we're sitting down and talking about, again, a structure. Victorian notions of gender and sexuality, Protestant conceptualizations of property, right, and common law, and so on and so forth. So this is the idea, and this is the story of 1492. This is the story of 1492 when indigenous land defenders are being referred to as jihadi terrorists by paramilitary corporations as Tiger or Swan that are an extension of the US military-industrial complex. When Black Lives Matter protesters are being referred to as Black extremist groups, a codification for terror, right, and Muslim terrorists. So how can we then not talk about the confluence of spirituality, of religion as an arc to this war that we've been born into? And again, I get it. People have internalized Islamophobia. Muslims have internalized Islamophobia, be it sort of, again, diaspora, Palestinian, Arab, and so on and so forth, because we don't know how to talk about Islam beyond, again, the conservative interpretations, beyond the liberal progressive interpretations, because of an abandonment of, as we were talking earlier, and cessation of that religious dimension. We don't know what to do with it. Meanwhile, the powers that be, when we talk about the Emirates, when we talk about Saudi Arabia, are using religion and are using religious scholars that exist in Euro-America. One of them, for instance, is Hamza Yusuf, a white revert convert, to normalize the Abraham Accords. Now, Hamza Yusuf is very much against, critical race theory. He actually denied the fact that, in a certain sense, there's anti-blackness. He cherry-picked and said, well, these are a few situations in which, Black people are being unjustly done too, as if there aren't Breonna Taylors, George Floyd's, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland's, and so on and so forth. Ongoing every single day. But again, this is part of the transition. Oh, well, I guess we're done with the Black Spring for now. We're just going to move on to something else. Right? And so these scholars are being conscripted as part of this religious battle, right? Shermaine Jackson, an African-American Muslim, he sits down on the UAE's Council of Elders, and they construct counter-extremism programs and so on and so forth. And we're going to sit down and talk, I assume, at a certain point about how Islamophobia informs both local as well as federal US policies. But this is why 1492 becomes very critical to this conceptualization, this dimension of spirituality. Again, how can we connect with our Mother Earth that is a spiritual subject, not an object, if we don't have some spiritual orientation towards her? How can we love with that spirit? How can we do anything with that spirit? That becomes the question, and this is why 1492, as a sense of internalized inferiority complexes and resentments and so on and so forth, that continue to manifest are part of that microfascism that we continue to re-embody. Oh, we don't want to deal with Islam. Religion has nothing to do with it. Allah is just a pile of rocks, really. And on the other hand, we see conservative, again, resistance movements that aren't liberatory, resistance movements, seeds of which are in Muslim Brotherhood thought, and so on and so forth, if you will, arguing for conservative interpretations of Islam, right? Codifications of Sharia laws that are assumed to be a monolith. Sharia isn't a monolith. It refers to actually the set of religious adjudications or fiqh or jurisprudence that has occurred over 1,444 years, insofar as since the dawn of Islam, if you will, which is a continuation of other traditions, given again over, as Islam acknowledges, 100, if not 200,000 different prophets that were sent to different tribes and nations. As the Quran says, we have created you from different tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. The best amongst you are those that vie for piety. Okay. That piety is embodied in the ethical, political, spiritual commitments then, that ontologically, epistemologically, all right? So where is Jesus of the oppressed? Where is Moses that stood before Pharaoh? Where is Muhammad that stood for social justice? That becomes the question. Insofar as that legacy, the monstrosity of 1492 and the orders that's instituted, because it basically says that, oh, well, you pre-modern everything, you medievalists, you have no systems and orders of yourselves in terms of governance, in terms of economics. And I'm not meaning to whitewash 1,444 years or, of Muslim history. Muslims have long lost their way after the Prophet died, and I argue that. right? Or going back to 1492, the very landscape has changed in so many different ways. Invasive species that have been introduced to the land, purple loosestrife didn't even exist, and the fact that we've all been disconnected from the land. Again, this is the irony. We're sitting down and talking about the downfall of capitalism, despite the fact that people of color are disconnected. We're urbanized. We're majority in the urban metropolis, and we're disconnected from land. Who controls the I-4 Rust Belt corridor? Well, it's the white farmers with stamp decrees, armed to the teeth, that feed the metropolis, right? And they're connected to the land more than people of color. We can't even grow our own food to feed ourselves, let alone our families, our communities, and so on. So where is the creation of alternatives, right? Where is the liberatory project? And that becomes the question. But that's 1492. That's why spirituality, that's why there's no running away. We sit down and look at the videos that are coming, whether it's from Al-Raida, whether it's from Nasrallah, whether it's from Ansarullah, and we look at, I shudder to think how those are secularized and religion has nothing to do with it. Look at the vocabulary that they use, look at the symbolisms, look at the material connotations that they deploy in terms of the Quranic verses insofar as their manifestation. So no, this is, and there is a dimension, a religious dimension of this war, and we need to contend with that. Again, this is part of contending with our misconceptions, our microfascisms in relationship to this amorphous thing called Islam that has become a bookie henchman for anybody and everybody to throw their weight behind. There is no contending with pinkwashing without dealing with homo nationalism here in the US. And again, homo nationalism and pinkwashing doesn't rely on just anti-queer Palestinian, anti-queer Arab sentiment. It relies on anti-Islamophobic or Islamophobic sentiment, because it says that, again, there are no queer traditions within Islam, there are no feminist traditions within Islam. And this is the irony of these world games that we have to play, that I have to identify as a Muslim anarchist, a Muslim feminist, as if Islam is inherently anarchistic or feminist, and so on. But I get why it's done. In order to address different communities that's and ideas that seem disparate from one another. But as I always say, I'm a set of conjunctive ands, not disjunctive ors, right? But anyways, I'll stop there. That's 1492 and religion and a lot of other stuff. So
No, I appreciate that. And I just want to say quickly, a quick news note is that Jailhouse Lawyers Speak shared a few minutes ago, about 30 minutes ago, that political prisoner Veronza Bowers in the United States is now free. So salute to everybody. I know there's people listening to this that have probably participated over the years in campaigns around Veronza's freedom. He's been inside since 1973, 46 years according to or 50 years according to Jericho movement. So anyways, I just wanted to note that for folks, and say welcome home to Veronza. So let's move into some of the repression that you've faced. So I think we've laid out some of probably what you will say in terms of why, but can you talk about what it is that you think has made you a specific target? You weren't so that, and you can clarify some of this, because I didn't really watch. I find a hard time watching like congressional hearings on this stuff because they're so detached from reality. But I don't think you were totally singled out. I think there were other professors, right, that they were talking about at the university, including you. But that there was a statement that, as I understand it, that you had been fired or that you would no longer work there, something of that effect. Statement by Minouche Shafik, who's the president of Colombia. And, you had mentioned to me when we were talking just prior to, setting this up, that you feel like a lot of right-wing analysts have a particular attention to some of the aspects within your analysis and your work that that they see as dangerous, that sometimes the left may not incorporate into their analysis or so on. So can you talk a little bit about what you think are some of the connections that draw attention to you by congressional figures, as well as university presidents and so on?
thank you, Jared. So it's There are other professors, absolutely. Dr. Joseph Mashat, Hamid Dabashi, and a few others, that were mentioned in passing. It's not the fact that I'm low-hanging fruit as a visiting assistant professor. It's my organizing experience. It's what it is that I say and what it is that I teach and what it is that I learn. I cast aspersion. I put to question this Ivy League brochure myth that Columbia has of itself as an extension of a settler state, neoliberal academy. And I call to question the American dream, which is an legitimate question, right? I call for the fact that land back Turtle Island is necessary for land back Palestine and that the liberation of both are entwined. So this is beyond Colombia. And this is what ostensibly makes what I learned from our movements, from our elders, from my organizing experiences, from my interdisciplinary scholarship as threatening. To right-wingers, to liberals, to progressives, even to leftists, right? There's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and being uncomfortable. Feeling uncomfortable, is a subject to a certain kind of unsettling, right? Being uncomfortable is something altogether different, right? And as much as feeling is an important side of sort of emotion and intellect, right? This is not at the service of protecting Jewish students, but at the service of what's happening, on campuses, but at the service really of Christian white supremacy. The reality, and I continue to say this, we can, in fact, and we should be able to live in a world together vis-a-vis our faith or a lack of our faith, where we can have dialogues to sort out our differences, our conflicts and grievances. And we must build a better world, not for us. I'm 44 now. I've lived a blessed life. And to me, it's not about just living years. It's the effectiveness of that and what it is that ostensibly I have to contribute to our peoples and our movements and to liberation, but rather for our children than for our youth. Because we should be able to engage in free exchange of ideas. Our children, as Momia Jamal had noted, are what come from immortality and are the eras that we shoot towards infinity. They teach us to relearn how to dream dangerously, again, particularly as adults. So this is about the chickens coming home to roost, and my emphasizing that in the context of Wadi al-Fayoum, who was murdered, a 6-year-old, in Plainsfield, Illinois, killed by his landlord who used to play with him and made a swing for him and so on and so forth 6 months ago, right? A Palestinian child who's 6-year-old. This is about him, the frightened sort of 6-year-old who was murdered when she was alone in a car with paramedics calling for help, right? This extends or is a part of Colombia being a badly managed real estate corporation with a bunch of assets in Lockheed Martin and HEICO and sort of BlackRock, Google, Microsoft, dual degree programs with Tel Aviv. And the collective dystopian outrage at protests, anti-genocide protests in the midst of ongoing genocide, right? And they have no decency in this. And this is unfortunately occurring now because, again, there are architects of animosity that are in positions of power who benefit from, again, conflict and disagreements between the people in the world of the below. I'm talking about the people that are on the streets, everyday human beings, right? And they're weaponizing our current moments to magnify the differences that exist between us, right? And, and as opposed to what brings us together. And of course, that includes Netanyahu, that includes Congress, that includes President of Colombia, of Shafik, that includes the White House, that has a say on how these protests, these encampments are anti-Semitic, right? And of course, the corporate mainstream media is part of that manufacturing consent and its desire to expand the degree of cognitive dissonance. So this is about the fact that I'm not just educating, I'm learning. And there's a difference between educating means that we're submitting ourselves to somebody to educate us. I'm learning with my students. But this is about us learning amongst ourselves as human beings, organizing. This is about building solidarity with one another, which I bring to the fore. This is about a project, my work, again, that I've learned from others, from my elders, from our movements of how to interconnect our struggles globally, from Palestine to Kashmir to Black folks to indigenous communities globally, Turtle Island, and so on and so forth. This is about me calling for, let us get into the streets. This is about calling for neighborhood assemblies to support our students, our student movements, and the demand for a liberated Palestine in conjunction with a liberated Turtle Island. And as a scholar, I was hired precisely at Columbia to teach, to be critical, to challenge it, to be challenged. This is part of my learning and my growth, right? And the interdisciplinary sort of venture that I'm engaged in. And there's nothing more beautiful than the modesty of constantly learning. This if you will, inquisitive thirst and hunger for knowledge that my students, my fellow colleagues remind me of. My experience, though, at the congressional hearings, had a chilling effect, if you will, within the academy. And I believe it was sort of April 17th, 2024, right? Perhaps it has something to do with, like I said, of how I talk, how I speak, let alone what it is that I teach and what it is that I argue. And I'm happy being questioned on what I argue, that my students are most entitled to do that, members of the general public are most entitled to do that. But there's a difference between information and knowledge, so let's speak from positions of knowledge as opposed to ignorance. But this has to deal really with the targeting of people in factories and workers in factories, hospitals, schools, you name it, all within the scope of the general public. And it's basically saying that if you choose to dissent, if you choose to not toe the line, you will be punished, you will be publicly humiliated, you will receive death threats. Your personal information will be disclosed online by the power structures in the US, which extends obviously to academic and non-academic institutions, government actors, and so on and so forth. So Columbia and the congressional hearings, if you will, behavior towards me is part and parcel of a national and a global trend. But it's beyond McCarthyism, and I'll say why. This has to fundamentally deal with Islamophobia, and not just, it includes anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian sentiment, but also Islamophobia insofar as the tarnishing, the punishing, the repressing of students, of faculty all across the world, right? This is beyond First Amendment that is supposed to be protected speech. This is about, obviously, again, what Palestine, if we listen to her in terms of dissent, and the context of 1492 has to teach us, right, in terms of not only Israel, but again, settler colony here and the Orwellian moment that we're living. And we can talk about what it is that I said, but we do have the reality that this committee, this congressional committee, is a sham, right? It's a kangaroo court, right? The U.S. House Committee on Education and the Workforce sort of that exists as much as the House Un-American Activities Committee, right, that existed. And this is, yes, it has to deal with U.S. tax scholars going to Gaza, as opposed to homeless people and dealing with houselessness and education and healthcare and so on. So, we'll continue to have these conditions because universities are a site, they're an extension of, the settler state, they're wards of the state, they're the strong arm of the state, a militarized arm of the state, as we've seen, but because also they're sites of resistance, not of liberation, right? So we're dealing with lies on the congressional floor. Minouche lied about the fact of, when I was hired in May of last year, not in October, actually, after I finished with Zionist Landgraf Cornell. She lied about the fact that I was terminated. She actually said the word terminated. She went on audaciously to subvert all mechanisms that exist, bureaucratic mechanisms, ethical mechanisms that exist within an institution, and so far as to undermine my expertise and the processes that exist as to what are the recourses of actions if indeed I am anti-Jewish, if indeed I am anti-Semitic. And she says, well, he's never going to be hired again, ever, in this executive decision. She did not fact check with regard to what it is that I said. And so far as, yes, okay, I'm supportive of anti-colonial resistance, or we're going to sit down and talk about that at a certain point, but I have issues with Hamas, I have issues with Hezbollah, I have issues with the mullahs in Iran. We can walk and chew gum without feeding into imperialism. Why? Because I have issues insofar as strategic commitments that I hold. Commitments against queerphobia, against sexism, patriarchy, hierarchization, authoritarianism, and by the way, that exists on the left too. All these ills exist on the left, let alone amongst liberals, let alone the right. So it's not just unique to al-Muqawama. They exist everywhere, given the mass psychology of fascism. So this is what it's about. But of course, they leave that portion of things aside. Somebody who writes on Islam and Anarchism, let alone Islam and queer Muslims, I understand, I confound, but then deal with the elements and terms of madness that I confound within, as opposed to just cherry picking. But that's the nature of what it is that we're contending with. And so instead of investigating real acts of anti-Jewish sentiments, right, and acknowledging their own complicity in terms of Islamophobia, we're seeing Minouche pander to right-wing forces as Stefanik that not too long ago, were very much, or are extension of, a bunch of white supremacists that were walking around again and saying, well, Jews were not replace us, in Charleston. This is the feckless alliance of powerfully positioned presidents, of Colombia, of somebody like Biden, and war profiteering, right? She lied or misled, it's one and the same thing. And why is it beyond McCarthyism? Because in a certain sense, like I said, Islamophobia is institutionalized in domestic policy. You have secret black site prisons exclusively for Muslims, not for Jews. FBI regularly surveils mosques, not necessarily synagogues. State legislators targeting Sharia law, right? By explicitly banning it, not Talmudic law. U.S. foreign policy insofar as, migration from Muslim majority countries and the Muslim ban. The government's funding of counter-extremism programs that only target Muslims, Muslim homes being raided by the FBI, right? Couched insofar as, well, concerns over terrorism, hate crimes against Muslims that require a higher bar of believability, right, than any other segment within society. Of course, we need to talk about anti-Judaism. I'm not going to say anti-Semitism because Arabs are Semites too, but we need to be able to talk about Islamophobia. So this is why, in a certain sense, they constitute. I guess I imagine, I believe, I'm considered as a threat. I'm photographed. It's not just hate mail; it's death threats. People are taking pictures of me on the subways. They're pointing at me as I'm walking down the streets. A Hamas supporter, and so on and so forth. Right? I had two IOF soldiers walk behind me as I'm going inside the encampment, and one says to the other, "Hey, you're Professor Abdou, the Hamas supporter. How does it feel that my friend here was a member of, or is a member of the IOF, and he killed Palestinians as if to solicit a rage from this angry brown man, to be broadcast on live television, if you will, have been undercover sort of videoed, and so on and so forth." This is the battle that I am an extension of, if you will, and this becomes part of the problem, the animus, in a very asinine way. So yeah, this is the problem.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all of that, and I just want to say, I I mean, it's just awful that anyone has to deal with that level of, you know, bullshit just in their daily life, and I know from other comrades I have that have gone through obviously you're on a very particular degree when it's, being broadcast on mainstream media and in front of Congress and so on. But, I will say, like, the Canary Mission apparatus and all of these kind of the things you describe, right, in terms of the right wing kind of gotcha media tactics, the IOF. I mean, it one of the things that I find so, I don't even know, but the ease through which people can be a participant in something like the IOF and just move through, but at the same time, same thing with the US military, right? So, like, this is, and in fact, those folks in the United States are lifted up on an even higher pedestal, of course. But yeah, I mean, it's just, anyway, I just want to say, my heart goes out to you that you're dealing with all of that, and I wish you strength and the ability to continue to, as I know you will, to move through the world. And I hope you have people around you who are helping to provide some safety and security for you. So just want to express that. um so let's talk about the encampments. Let's talk about New York organizing. I know that you've obviously been, you were at Columbia and you have been involved in organizing and student activity there, supporting teach-ins, etc. I've also seen, video of you at CUNY and other places too. Some of it probably maybe taken by right-wing provocateurs. I don't know, but these things are out there, and so. Are there any reflections that you kind of want to share about the encampments, the student movement today, and so on?
Thank you. The encampments are an embodiment of liberation and not just a resistance or anti-colonial resistance, because resistance can be reactionary or tends to be reactionary. Right, Jared. And what they embody is, and I'm reminded by guerrilla intellectual sort of Walter Rodney, and I've said this on a few occasions of late, right? And how Europe underdeveloped Africa, when he talks about how a culture, liberatory culture, is a total way of life. Our students, these encampments embody a different way of eating, of sleeping, of walking, of talking, of celebrating, if you will, liberation, of celebrating and contending with not only birth, because there are kids, children, literally children in these encampments, families, and so on, but also how they treat death with dignity. They embody what Kwame Ture had noted insofar as, well, the knowledge I have now is not the knowledge I had then when they walked into these encampments. I've known these students since I arrived in January. You know, and there's a difference again because revolutions are about practical questions, right? And it's about creation. It's not about destruction. And they did create, and all the wonder to them. They manifested horizons of imagination that adults, because of our insecurities, because of our fears, because we get entangled in hierarchies of power and careerism, you know, cap in terms of the possibilities and impossibilities that exist in the world. They are contending, as we all are, with a settler state, like I said, and not just Colombia, as Harshawala had, recently noted. Encampments are not only zones of asserting authority or demands and refusals, but they embody community and communing, making decisions together, shura, right? Community consensus, enacting solidarity as a verb, learning how to engage with autonomy, liberation, disagreements, right? They are figurations of imagination, of connection, without any kind of prefiguration, because what they're doing, these students, these youth, is allowing the land to teach us. They're walking with the land and not on it. And yet how they become pathologized, right? And pathologized in ways by white supremacy that is more devoted to order, if you will, that prefers a negative peace and the absence of tension as opposed to positive peace, which is the presence of justice, as Martin Luther King had referred to it, right? And what they're dealing with is settler state violence, not just insofar as the violence that is used to produce the law, to conserve the law, to enact the white man's law, but also the violence that is reenacted in fascistic ways, the horizontalist violence vis-a-vis folks that are referred to as counter-protesters, despite the fact that many of them include off-duty sort of ex-police officers, as Dylan Rodriguez had noted, Zionist pro-genocide zealots, or right-wing terrorists, right? And so this whole political theater, whether it's Congress, whether it's Colombia, right? And these are students that leave me bereft, because they're adamant about their values and principles, and they galvanized faculty, right, in so many different ways. And there are students that were subjected to chemical terrorist attacks on campus that still Colombia has not dealt with. And they're well organized. The food areas, the medic areas, they picked up their trash. They had prohibitions against harassment, littering, drugs, alcohol, the extreme state of calm and festiveness, the element of de-escalation, of security, of safety that they cultivated, right? And yet they're labeled as as not only terrorists, but trespassers, and they had to be suspended for that to happen on their own campus, right? And of course, the subversion of mechanisms by the institution, the settler state and Minouche, insofar as the Senate, in the context of Colombia, that was established after 1968. And the systems of procedures, insofar as the administration must consult with the Senate before calling the police on campus, the police that exist right now, to the point that faculty were not allowed on campus till a few days ago. Till now, students are not allowed on their own campus that you pay tuition for, unless they are students that live in residence, right? So Shafik never sat down with the Students in Jewish Voices for Peace or SJVP to talk to Jewish students instead about different perspectives. She didn't talk with faculty or draw upon faculty sort of, who condemned her conflation of anti-Semitism with Zionism and so on and so forth, right? And instead set up this task for anti-Semitism with this ambiguous sort of definition of anti-Semitism that threatens really everyone, Steve, the Jews and non-Jews alike, right? So this is the condition that is informed by, oh, well, American values or Jewish values, right? Which is highly problematic, right? But this is the degree of carcerality that exists within academia that is an extension of US imperial settler power that capitulates to DEI sort of tactics and so on. You know, our martyr George Jackson had noted, it follows that if a thing is not a building, it is certainly decaying, that life is revolution, and that the world will die if we don't read and act out its impairments. And these kids, these youth, they were reading inside the encampments. We were having classes. I was having my classes inside the encampments. They were the first stop that I made in the morning when I woke up crying because of a sense of loss, of isolation, of loneliness. And the last place that I left at night in which my heart was just being ripped apart because I was waiting to see them the next day, or I was afraid that something would happen in the blink of an eye while I went in a half state of death, getting some rest at home, right? But this is the banality, if you will, as Malcolm had noted, that if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people that are doing the oppression, right? But this also speaks to the Orwellian moment, right? Of, again, free speech, the superficiality of just words, of terms, spread freedom of social justice in the context of the Tahrir, the emptying of words, or the hollowing it out of words and their meanings, you know. Civilians killed are referred to as casualties of war, you know, CIA kidnappings are referred to as extraordinary renditions. Empire loves euphemisms. So, but where is the freedom? Where's the freedom for Julian Assange? Where's the freedom for these youth to express themselves in doing something that's productive? Where's the freedom for Shireen Abu Akleh? Where's the freedom when it comes to the CIA illegally spying on journalists, lawyers, etc.? Where is the 109 Palestinian? Where's the freedom for 109 Palestinian journalists and media workers that have been murdered in Gaza? You know, those that were arrested. You know, where are those that are the 3 Lebanese journalists, at least, that were killed by Israel? Where's the freedom when we're talking about WikiLeaks? Where's the freedom when we're talking about consortium news, if you will, censorship vis-a-vis news guards for the establishment front organizations, let alone the warrantless surveillance of over hundreds of millions of Americans? These are youth that, just to put things in perspective, were exposed over the last week to microwave hearing sort of systems, Al-Raida, right? Because in an attempt to suppress dissent. These are youth that were evicted, that were suspended, that were exposed to police brutality. These are youth in which student journalists were forbidden from actually covering sort of the siege that happened insofar as the sweeps with regard to Hinds Hall, right? And this is President Shafik calling in the police, not once, now twice, despite the fact that she regretted it the first time, calling in and said, I'm not going to do it again, but this is, here we are. But these are the encampments in which you had every press on earth. Yeah, of course, you have grifters, celebrity activists. You also had House Speaker Mike Johnson, accompanied by the Proud Boys, of course, right? By organized white nationalists that were trying to scale the gates and yell and go back to Gaza, calling students monkeys. But this is the confluence of power in which we have Eric Adams, you know, Baron Munchausen, sort of the Wizard of Oz or Pinocchio or whatever, who wants to go live in the Golan Heights, you know, in Israel, and he refers to sort of the occupied Golan Heights as part of Israel, as opposed to Syrian territory. But coming down and referring to how these students are radicalized by professional academics, how they're reading sort of terror books. But this is the bipartisan sort of like front that he's an embodiment of. 300 arrests, 2,500 nationally. There's nothing illegal about radicalizing students who aren't children, by the way, but this is Adams confessing to even violating sort of like the First Amendment, right? The word even, you know, outside agitators as a racist term, you know, naked authoritarian term that he's using, right? Is completely dismissive of sort of the racist origins of the terms that was used by the Jim Crow South as a way to demonize civil rights sort of movements, right? So this isn't happenstance, right? And then we have like NYPD Chief of Patrol John Chill, who was central in the planning and the execution of both raids in Colombia in the past 2 weeks, who was actually a murderer of Ortan Ziso, sort of Pavel, in 2008. He actually fired you know, a bullet unintentionally. Somebody could have been killed. A kid could have been killed, and this is beyond sort of like, you know, the tear gas, the tear gas, the flash bombs, the batons. Like, what are you doing insofar as, you know, trying to retake over a building from students that have done this before in 68 and other times over, Vietnam War and otherwise, right? But this is the grimly hilarious sort of condition in which, yeah, we have Deputy Commissioner Daughtry, holding up a book and like, oh, look at the terrorism book that I recovered, not understanding that it's an introduction to terrorism that was written by renowned historian Charles Townsend. So this is the kind of crackdown that we're witnessing, that even Columbia professors like Rebecca Weiner, who's a Columbia professor who leads an NYPD intelligence division that maintains an office in Tel Aviv and wants to crack down. Why? Because she feels that the rhetoric solicits and warrants a violent rape, right? So this is what Minouche facilitated against our kids, right? Who renamed the building after a 6-year-old who was murdered in Palestine. Hint, right? And NYPD officers that exist right now on campus and are sexually harassing, that are predators insofar as women and gender dissidents and so on. I'm in awe of our youth. They are personally, for me, my backbone, my spine, the very whip of a tongue that I speak truth to power. And they teach me every single moment of every day. And I miss them so much since that encampment got taken down. And I can't even... My building is off Morningside to the main campus. I can't even dare walk into Morningside, which I'm finally allowed onto because I couldn't bear the sight of sort of the east lawn where the encampment was. I couldn't. My heart can't bear it to sit down and witness it right now. So,
wow. Anything that you want to add? Because I know we didn't really talk about it too much, but you've also seen some of the other encampments and things going on in the city. Anything you want to share just in terms of like those experiences?
we also got a chance to see the encampments beyond the city in the context of Wesleyan, right? They went from, I was giving a talk there that was organized by my elder Kaywalani on Islam 1492 and Palestine. And they grew from 20 tents to 30 to 100 tents. I mean, again, these are organizing spaces in which Muslims, Jews, Christians are conducting prayers. Atheists are there. Everybody's learning. The Zapatistas have a wonderful saying that holding each other's hands while we ask one another what each of us knows. And this is how we discover the revolutionary horizon together without leaving anybody behind. And they embodied that. So they moved past the juncture of mobilization. And this is what made these two intifadas, these encampments, very dangerous for the dominant order, because they became a site of more than just mobilization. We were talking about the difference between mobilization and organization. They went beyond protest. They started to invest. Oh, what does land back here mean, or land back Palestine mean in the context of here? And these are the spaces that we need to cultivate. And this is the work that can only be done face to face. It can't be done during a protest, which again offers an opportunity as a moment of catharsis, but doesn't lead really anywhere besides a patting on the shoulder. Oh, I did my bit for Palestine today. Okay, but what does that then do? How does that translate on the land and face to face? And in terms of breaking bread and getting to know one another's communities as human beings, of disrupting again the austerity and the animus that the powers that be that I discussed thrive and cultivate in terms of magnifying the disagreements between us. So, yeah, all the encampments are manifesting that. The question to me becomes, how can we assist in supporting our youth insofar as organizing these encampments in relationship to one another as a decentralized network that embody a sort of solidarity without solidity, a non-hierarchical relationship between them that allows for a degree of ingenuity that is constantly being reinvented, being rethought through, because that is part of the revolutionary horizon, to constantly rethink, to not be crystallized in power dynamics, to think on the spot. And how we can embolden them. How can we learn from them? How can we take the spirit of these encampments? Why don't we have faculty encampments? I mean, that's a question. Why don't we have, and aren't we manifesting more mobile encampments, right? And places as a gentrified sort of like Harlem and Manhattanville, given Columbia's role in that, and anti-blackness, and so on and so forth. So to me, this becomes sort of our responsibility, whether it's as media, as knowledge keepers, as knowledge producers, to amplify all that, but to think of also creative ways in which we can grow. The encampments, and I said this before, get a projector, get a white screen, bring in people that are comfortable from Gaza. And we had, at least in this encampment, Bisan send us a message, that was broadcast and so on. But how do we get these encampments also to speak to one another face to face and beyond sort of signal groups? Because this is not armchair activism here. And that's what I'm trying to rethink through. That's what I'm trying to encourage these encampments to organize in relationship to one another, right? Because that's a transition from a temporary autonomous zone to a semi-permanent autonomous zone to perhaps a permanent one. The growing of food, because of our relationship to land, again, on all the living embodiment of the creation of a new society, of creation and the inception of hope, because hope is not this rhetoric, but hope requires action. These youth are not engaging in polemics. Again, they understand the fact that there's a difference between revolutions as they're in historically and people's revolutionary becomes in terms of our internal transformation. Revolution is about practical questions. What are you going to do with the army? What are you going to do with a nuclear power plant? What are you going to do when somebody gets sick? What are you going to do when somebody gets hungry? And they involve the transformation of the way that we eat, the way that we sleep, the way that we conceive of intimacy, etc. And they've embodied that. They've challenged themselves. They're combating their inner microfascisms individually, collectively. They're learning in conjunction with one another and pushing things forward. That's what made them a threat. And I'm in awe of all of them, of the encampments that I've been to, of the encampments that I hope to visit. And they represent sort of the breath of fresh air that movements, again, as the Zapatistas have taught, as the Panthers that also created alternatives, the breakfast programs, the knowledge-based and educational programs. This is what needs to be created within our neighborhoods, within broader society, right? Because we need to get the people are on our streets and our neighborhoods talking and building upon this. This isn't something just for university-style settings. We need to take that spirit of Tahrir, the spirit of the encampment, elsewhere that didn't happen in Tahrir. So.
Appreciate that. So there's another thing you talk about in the book, going back to that for a bit, which is, I often hear this from my anarchistic comrades, friends, is a discussion of, there's a discussion of the politics of the demand versus kind of the politics of the act. You kind of, argue that the politics of the demand have always led to reformism within capitalist agendas, even at the height of non-aligned or third world anti-colonial movements. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about that perspective, and maybe try to make it concrete for folks, if you could, and speak about it in relation to recent struggles, including current ones.
Thank you. In terms of our ancestors and third worldist Bandung conferences, Pan-Africanist, Pan-Asian, Pan-Arab, and so on trajectories, I believe that there was a faltering because of the assumption of, as much as they were trying to, obviously, and they were fighting anti-colonial, engaged in anti-colonial resistance, they weren't thinking of the horizon of liberation, particularly so far as the nation state. They thought that the master's tools would be able to dismantle the master's house. And so the assumption was, as much as they were anti-capitalist, as much as they were trying to create, in so many ways, socialist alternatives to it, they were still trying to use the nation state, which is the governing model that was handed over by European colonizers. And yes, there was an attempt to break through that. Nasser had the idea of sort of the smaller Africa, Egypt, Libya, Sudan, conjoin them together, draw sort of around their boundaries, and you'll get the idea of a smaller Africa. Egypt had the labor, Sudan had, in a certain sense, the land and the Fertile Crescent, and so on and so forth, and being alongside the Niles, and then Libya had sort of the capital, if you will. And that was constrained, but it's constraining because, again, you're dismissing the fact that, though the state and capitalism, though they may have short-term animosities, their long-term strategic interests are one and the same. And neoliberal globalization broke the bubble, or burst the bubble with regards to that. I mean, there's a thing and validity to what Trump is saying insofar as the swamp. Yeah, it's a toxic affair, and there is no cleansing it. that way. But the politics of demand is, Charles Taylor, is Fanon, is Glenn Coulthard, is Leanne Simpson. It's the politics of assimilation into the settler states. And I start off the book by sitting down, and this is not to disrespect or to diss in any way, shape, or form Sister Ilhan Omar and so on, but this is perhaps the manifestation of the problem, right? And this is not to condone at all the false and the anti-Black violence she's exposed to, or the force for the anti-Semitic charges that have been leveled against her by Zionist lobbies. But during the height of Black Lives Matter, she's standing and she's flanked by Angela Davis. And this is how the book, in a certain sense, opens up and says, well, this country is founded on genocide. Actually, it's ongoing genocide, sister, as we discussed earlier. And then she says, well, and it's founded on slavery. Actually, it's afterlife to slavery projects, as we discussed. And then she says, well, look at me, I'm an example of the American dream. This is the politics of demand that reifies the settler state, because what you're saying is that you have bought into the settler psyche. You have bought into the project of recognition, upward mobility, of civilizationism, of progress, into the fantasy, the illusion of 531 years that has become crystallized in a whitewashed way. And you're not interested, again, because in constructing alternatives which can't happen within the system. The system is inherently purgatory. It's not reformatory that way. And what it speaks to in engaging in that is the poverty of imagination. Do Indigenous people not have their own models of sovereignty, nationalism that are anti-statist? I know for a fact that they do. The same thing with Black nationalism that isn't necessarily taken within its state formations. Ashanti Alston had written about this. He was a former member of the Black Liberation Army and my elder and identifies as a Panther anarchist. Lorenzo Irvin had written about this. There are so many different anarchistic, let's put it this way, anti-authoritarian traditions that have noted this, right? So this becomes the question in a certain sense. Look at what's happening with the Zapatistas with a leftist president in power insofar as Obrador, right? And, our ability to then no longer constrain impossibilities, that becomes the question. If colonialism and imperialism stole anything, it's our ability to dream dangerously again. And I keep on saying this. And this is what constantly leads to, oh, well, let me just assimilate into the system, engage in a politics of recognition and change things from within, which is the problem as opposed to, again, the politics of the act in which we take there's a reason we say all power to the people, because all power already exists to the people. So why are we relinquishing it to corporations, to the state? This was the problem of the Tahrir moment. That, hey, we've taken control of land, of Tahrir Square, that is ours. We're cleaning. We're literally getting down on our hands and knees and washing Tahrir Square because we felt this land is ours. And all of a sudden, okay, we're going to relinquish it to the powers that be. We didn't talk about the differences between us, the leftists, the Marxists, the anarchists, the feminists, the liberals, the Nasserites, the Muslim Brotherhood, the atheists, the queers, and so on and so forth. We didn't organize. But we simply mobilized. Brett Reno and social justice. You ask two people the same question from the same ideological background, and they'll give you different responses. We're willing to embody that. So revolutionary transformation requires the fact that we understand the difference between strategy and tactic. I don't mind that people appeal to international law or to voting, but voting is not a kind of harm reduction when it's taken up as a strategy. Because we're talking about voting within the context of settler colonialism. What is that supposed to do towards indigenous sovereignty and towards land back and Black self-determination? This is the issue. Oh, the ICC rulings and the celebration of it. Well, we know international law is a product of, again, colonial imperial order. And yet we subscribe to it holistically as a strategy, and we have endless panels that are discussing it as opposed to discussing organizing beyond the dominant order of the nation state and capitalism. So that's what is meant by the politics of the act versus the politics of demand, of constantly reconfiguring ourselves within the settler order, if you will, as opposed to moving beyond it, assimilating vis-a-vis, again, oh, I'm LGBTIQ. Okay, well, we need to understand that sexual identity politics are highly problematic because they eliminate that this is more about gender than sexuality, that sexuality is a modern identity politique developed by the white man to disclose the most intimate recesses of what it is that we do in the privacies of our own homes, and yet we want to have privacy while we're outing ourselves. So there's a way to engage in all these kinds of discussions without feeding into homonationalism and pinkwashing, and manifesting and talking about the pre-modern ways of conceiving the world in terms of intimacy and the right to intimacy and privacy that way. And we can look at tons of literature insofar as Muslim folklore to try and create or think outside the box of these different ways. Al-Katib's encyclopedia, 10th century encyclopedia of pleasure, right? And Nasruddin al-Tusi's The Sultan's Sex Potions was discussing these dimensions of same-sex practices and intimacies that conservative Muslims sanitize, right, and sterilize as part of our traditions. So this becomes the problem of reactionary politics, of the politics of assimilation, that let me fight for a Palestinian state. Well, I don't agree with the Palestinian state. I don't agree with any state. Right? Tell me, who's the state going to be for? Is it going to be against Sharia law, or is it going to be Protestant neoliberal conceptualizations of property of law, and so on? And who does that leave insofar as leftist frameworks, insofar as Christians, insofar as queers, insofar as feminists, insofar as who gets stuck in the middle of all this, right? And for what, again, are we not capable of, more ingenious kinds of ways, especially when we're talking about Gaza, that's actually a part of North Africa, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, thinking outside the box. That's what the politics of demand versus the politics of the act, if you will, requires or incepts within us. So
Yeah. So you talked about it a little bit there, brought it up, and you've talked about it throughout this discussion to some degree. But you've mentioned your involvement in Tahrir, in 2011, and then as you said, you were kind of against 2013. So as well as you've talked about this throughout, also spending time with the Zapatistas on multiple occasions. So what were some practical lessons that you took away from those experiences?
thank you. Any revolutionary movement has to have three things, and without those three things, it's not much of a revolutionary movement. Number one, you need to create alternatives, alternative schools, alternative hospitals, actual alternatives. Again, these encampments embody the library, they embody sort of medical center, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Needs to grow their own food, and so on and so forth, community garden, and the more the merrier. Seizing the means of production of power for ourselves. Number two, the creation of discursive alternatives, alternative modes of thinking, of conceiving of the world, within the framework, ideally, of 1492, insofar as elucidating what connects our struggles together. Number three, and this is the controversial thing, ostensibly, but this is why it's words and is worthy of kind of discussion, is the preparation for armed conflict. And that is part of the reality of the world, right? Violence is a tactic. It's not a strategy. So again, but we need a biodiverse strategy of liberation that way. Why? As Fanon said, decolonization is an inherently violent act. It involves violence because we have to undo our sense of ourselves and of each other, our own sense of our own identities. But it's also violent because we're dealing with symbolic, with structural, with systemic forms of violence, capitalism, as well as the state. We're dealing with violence amongst one another, the racism, the sexism, the xenophobia that we re-embody, that we reenact in our microfascistic tendencies with one another, not a form of, if you will, violence. Of course it is, right? Now, the Zapatistas and the Panthers preserved the right to self-defense as a tactic, not as a strategy, because they built alternatives. I mean, again, we need to think practically here insofar as what are we defending if we don't create alternatives? The Quran said, and this is sort of part of the misquotation or the fact that it wasn't even reported, that when I said or read two Quranic verses that weren't even identified as Quranic verses. And what I mean by that is when I said, وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَبِيرَةٍ, right? Referring to what has happened. And what is that verse? How much of a small group defeated a larger enemy, right? And this is part of the reality. It's always a David and Goliath situation. And the Quran also says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُم مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, and prepare for them what is necessary of strength, okay, in terms of alternatives and in terms of self-defense. right? So that means black power, that means red power, that means talking about qital, which is the actual word for fighting in Islam, not jihad. Jihad literally means to struggle. And yes, there's the larger jihad, the struggle against one's own microfascisms, but also the smaller jihad, which does mean self-defensive warfare. But the actual word for fighting is qital. So not all forms of jihad are qital, and not all forms of qital are jihad, and there are rules to war, and so on and so forth, right? So there's an ethics and a code. And so again, there's a difference between reactionary sort of fighting even and liberation, because most people that go to war tend to be men with in terms of healing and the reproduction of sort of the ills that and the traumas and that are projected on women, on gender dissidents once men come back from war, right? But we have to also understand the fact that violence and resistance to colonialism is codified within international law. It is both moral and legal. You have the UNGA Resolution 3743 that affirmed the legitimacy of the struggle of people towards liberation from colonial and foreign domination, right? And foreign occupation by all means available. That includes armed struggles, right? So I think this becomes really important in terms of, when we're talking about armed warfare as a tactic. I don't think that should be the emphasis of movements there or encampments now.
1 second. Your mic got a little bit. The sound dropped a little bit. I'm
Yeah,
wondering
sorry, because my earphones ran out of batteries. So can you still
okay,
hear
okay.
me okay?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'll try and bring the computer closer. So, any honest accounting has to contend with the fact of and this idea of violence, because it seems that we can't protest peacefully, we can't boycott peacefully, we can't engage in hunger strikes, we can't blockade traffic, we can't self-emulate, we can't tackle politicians on account of respectability politics, we can't march, we can't dissent, we just simply can't be, right? So, the yardstick really needs to be regauged again. Um, and this becomes very important insofar as, when it comes to the fact that you and me and our ability to protect ourselves against lynchings, against forced mass starvation, against sterilization, sanitizing, genociding, ethnic cleansing, they tell us to be nonviolent. Shame on them. When it comes, and when somebody like us, like Malcolm, had stood and said, what we're advocating for is violence, because that's what they say, right? They say that we're all terrorists, right? Despite the fact that they have monopoly over violence and the tools of war and weapons of mass destruction in this asymmetric war, because it assumes a war of symmetry between, again, anti-colonial sort of resistance movements as Hamas and so on and so forth, and states that have no boundaries, that have no borders, as Israel, that is a nuclear state, that has access to F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, that has nuclear submarines, that has, aircraft carriers, and so on. So what kind of symmetry is this? And this becomes the question, right? And Walter Rodney had posited, by what reasoning or logic do we assume that the violence that enslaved uses to undo their cycles is the same as the violence that is used? That is employed by the colonizer. And this becomes the question, right? You can't say that you're not going to have an explosion when you leave the conditions, the ingredients for violence precisely there. And you can't stop this with love. Sorry, like this is about power, right? So we can only mean vigorous action and self-defense, and that vigorous action needs to feel justified when initiating and being initiated by all means that are necessary. And yet we should expect that, yes, we're going to be called as, as racists in reverse, right? And this becomes part of the reality. But tell me, that's the same reality that assassinated Rodney in 1980, that assassinated Lumumba, that assassinated...
Uh-oh, you got muted there. What happened?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is the violence that assassinated Malcolm in 65, MLK in 68. This is, they condemned that assassinated Sankara in 87. This is the violence that assassinated Fred Hampton in 69. And so, in a certain sense, they condemned Nat Turner until they didn't. They condemned Nelson Mandela and the ANC up until they didn't. They condemned Toussaint
l'ouverture until they didn't. And then Netanyahu said Hamas is good for us. They condemned Gandhi, the anti-black, racist, misogynist Gandhi, until they didn't. They condemned Yasser Arafat and the PLO until they didn't, and awarded him even a Nobel Peace Prize, right? So what does it mean to be a citizen of a country, right, that has been on the wrong side of every liberation struggle, as Audre Lorde had said, on earth? Do we want to talk about the violence of the Deir Yassin massacre, the Abu Shusha massacre, the Tantura massacre, the Lida massacre, the Saliha massacre of 48, the Dawamiya massacre of 48, the Qabiya massacre of 53, the Kafr Qassam, the Khan Yunis massacres of 56, the Sabrat Shatila, the Al-Aqsa massacre of 90, the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre, the Jenin refugee camp? This didn't happen October 7th. So this becomes the question. Violence, we have been born into war, whether we recognize it or not. And we're complicit in that war because we've learned to humanize the white man, to bleach our skin bloody white before we come to recognize our own humanity. Before do we come to recognize our complicity in each other's struggles, the violence that we reenact one another. All we learn from oppression is learning how to repeat it until we engage in projects of healing, of decolonizing, of abolition. But that requires a different environment in which we're able to live and to cultivate these different manifestations. So that is what one learns, if you will, from the Zapatistas, from Tahrir, why Tahrir failed in a certain sense, because again, the politics of assimilation, the politics of reform, I want a secular democracy, the arrogance that Egyptians embodied, middle to upper class English-speaking youth, that, oh, we're going to show the world, as opposed to learning from the Zapatistas, from Panthers, and the necessity to even learn from those to transition from anti-colonial resistance to liberation, which again, Hamas simply is, Hezbollah simply is. They're anti-colonial resistance. They don't depict liberatory horizons in terms of alternatives, alternative realities in relationships to 1492. So that becomes the question. And I know you have another question in Tahrir, so maybe I could just talk a little bit about decolonization to elucidate what that is and what we learn from specifically Tahrir, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if you want, I don't know how you're doing on time, but okay. Yeah. I mean, I think if you want to add a little bit on that, and then, I do want to give space for us to talk about how, remind folks how they can support you. And then there are some audience questions, so I could pull those in after that if you have time. But, yeah, go ahead.
So, Tahrir teach a lot of things, and it's a catastrophe. We have 60,000, 70,000 political prisoners in Egypt. Lefties that cheered, and feminists and a lot of others that cheered the slaughter of the Muslim Brotherhood in the encampments of Rab'a al-Nahda that I was with, the two sit-ins. It's about 15 minutes away from where I lived. And look at what they ushered now, and so far as Sisi. So people, بيترحموا على أيام Mubarak, they're longing for the days of Mubarak. And that is because they did not want to transcend the secular religious binary. And I get it. Again, we've only been exposed to authoritarian interpretations of Islam, conservative interpretations of Islam, but this is why I was losing my mind saying we need to contend with this. And again, we do have examples historically of leftist Islamist or Muslim formations. I don't want to say Islamist because that's an Orientalist term. But the refusal to deal with that is what led to the massacre of the Muslim Brotherhood, the largest genocide, if you will, of modern Egyptian history. And so there's internalized Islamophobia among secularists. And again, this is not to condone or to say that the Muslim Brotherhood, others didn't cultivate that animus. The state also had a role in that. Religious institutions had a role in that. And the fact that they embody anti-Coptic sentiment, and of course, Coptic communities have also replicated Islamophobic sentiments, and so on and so forth, as opposed to working through our various different traditions, right? But this is what decolonization entails in so many different ways. It is about building non-statist, non-authoritarian, land-based spiritual alternatives and being able to defend them tactically with arms if need be. But that's not the central figuration. When Prophet Muhammad first established the first polity, right, they were forbidden from bearing arms or even defending themselves. They're subjected to boycott, to torture, to persecution, all kinds of atrocities. And they had to engage in two migrations. First to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, underneath the protection of King Najash, a Christian king who later became a Muslim. And then after that to Medina. Why? Because they needed to learn how to build community. And then finally, the verse was revealed that وَكُتِبَ الْقِتَالُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَهُوَ مَكْرُوهٌ لَكُمْ. And war has been written towards you, although you may find it detestable. So this is Creator, this is Allah, this is Yahweh, whatever name that you want to give this God. I really don't care, right? Even acknowledging that war is detestable, of course it's detestable. But there's a difference between morals and ethics. Thou shalt not kill is a beautiful moral commandment, but God forbid should somebody come and threaten our way of life, our way towards we are seeking justice and peace. We reserve the ethical right to defend ourselves. And I'm not going to get into again like that, like do we constrain the person? Do we do this? Do we that? That's another question. But the ethical rights, that's the difference between morals and ethics. Right? But decolonization then means abolishing the punitive sort of prison judicial, the imperialist military industrial complex, and replacing them with transformative and not just restorative justice. So because the former addresses underlying state structures, but particularly the structure of settler colonialism here that frames abolition and indigenous sovereignty and Black self-determination. It involves thinking about, oh, okay, what does Black self-determination mean in the context of Africa when we're sitting down and talking about Africa, and when we're talking about Africa that is our mother Africa, the size of East and West Europe, let alone the US, Canada, China. That's how big, Japan, that's how big Africa is, right? So what does Black liberation mean there? And we have to deal with a lot. I mean, Muslims have anti-Blackness, we have Arab supremacy, we have Sunni supremacy, we have Shiite supremacy. So this is why, if you will, I hope that the work that I do becomes important. And decolonization demands this consistent spiritual and practice-based relationship with land, as well as attunement to harvesting and replenishment cycles. Food-based sovereignty, security means relearning how to walk the land, right? And engaging in radical eco-psychological, permacultural sort of tools, techniques, bioregionalism, herb and horticultural methods, ways of cultivating more homeostatic equilibriums. It means allowing for land to teach us vis-a-vis what I noted earlier of al-ghaib, of the unknown. We can't pre-calculate and predetermine everything within a revolution. We have certain experiments historically that, yeah, we can say, okay, well, XYZ is necessary for, a manifestation of a difference. But at the end of the day, we have to allow room for non-human life to teach us at the same time. So it involves decolonization, abolition, substituting multinational agrochemical and agricultural biotechnological companies as Monsanto with harvest practices that are mindful of land and replenishment cycles as an alternative to colonial perspectives. It's, again, learning how to grow our own food, sharing, dealing with our own sense of selves, access to land, withdrawance of our dependency and reliance on capitalism. Like I said, we're sitting down and talking down with capitalism. We don't even know how to grow our own food. Building sufficiency, contending with the medical and the pharmaceutical industrial complexes that must be replaced by traditional holistic healing practices that, yes, includes modern medicine, but medicine is just more than just, what modernity has taught of it. It involves spirituality. It involves a lot of different techniques. So it involves the rematriation of indigenous land, given the hundreds of break-in treaties, and imagining, if you will, and undoing the shackles of human misery, of death, of our devaluing, and the redressing of grievances, if you will. And without addressing Islam or 1492, we'll never and will continue to persist. We'll uphold ahistorical narratives as, oh, you Arabs were slave traders no different than the Europeans. It's just like, what is this ahistoricity? I'm not saying that, I'm not condoning slavery, but what are we talking about here, right? And Arab slavery or Muslim slavery, number one, Islam advocated an abolitionist perspective of freeing the slaves. Muslims reneged on that. That's something we should sit down and talk about. But slavery doesn't mean that you owned the slave. It wasn't racialized as it was with white slavery. It wasn't plantation economy. The slave had rights. Again, I'm not defending slavery. I'm just saying, okay, let's actually talk from perspectives of positions of knowledge. We have the opportunity now, and we cannot allow this to be another Tahrir moment for our people. Our people in Gaza, my people, are not dying for people to walk around with kufiyah tote bags and dresses. This is not what this moment is about. And if it is, then we've already been tokenized, we've already been co-opted and lost. And there's a lot of that. What does it mean to be scrolling through genocide vis-a-vis phones mined from another genocide of copper and cobalt in the Congo? I mean, unless we create alternatives, this becomes a key to the imaginary world that we are trying to found. My people, indigenous people here, are our Black kin, our Black siblings. We are worthy of a different world. And we need to assert the dignity and respect. But we're not dying for artificial modalities of solidarity here. And if this is what this is about and people don't call it out, and and again, the difference between armchair Twitteratis that are very prominent within our movements, and we don't need to name names and so on. I mean, again, people need to question whose voices are we elevating here? People that have organizing experience, or just people that are sitting down and repeating the same conversations over and over again? Are we just platforming careerist academics or intellectuals that have gotten their hands dirty on the ground? This is the legacy that Malcolm and Martin leave us. Their beauty, and so many others, Stokely, Walter, so many others, was the fact that they were loyal to their people. They did not covet the hallways and corridors of power. They did not covet representational politics. They were accountable to their people. And they embodied a degree of humility and modesty that were unparalleled, because they understood that that was part of their metamorphosis and learning. And certainly Malcolm was the best example of that. He was not ideological. And he was both a mobilizer and organizer. Martin was a mobilizer. He wasn't a great organizer, as Kwame Ture had noted. I'll leave it at that. And we can address in terms of like how I can be supported. I mean, I'll just say very briefly, please engage the work. There's a lot of gatekeeping of it amongst movements, amongst organizers, amongst academics in particular, in the carceral systems, as much as they proclaim interdisciplinarity, intersectionality in whitewashed ways. Please support our youth, our children. Please, there's a petition that's going around that I can sit down and talk. I gave talks with the Electronic, and I'm very blessed with the Electronic and to follow, with Jodi, with the Red Nation. Listen, I don't profess and don't proclaim to know anything. What I know amounts to a grain of salt in the oceans of the world. And I say this not out of a false sense of modesty. My life is actually meaningless. If it is something, if it speaks to something, if the story is, or the embodiment of it, insofar as Muhammad is involved, because we're not individuals, we're networks of relations of power. It is what these networks, what so many movement elders, organizers, scholars, teachers, ancestors have taught me over the course of 44 years. What is my life in retrospect to Wadi al-Fayoum, the 6-year-old that I mentioned, or to Hind, or a 14-year-old who is literally sniped in Tahrir Square, being carried across to medics? What is one's life worth? And we need to ask ourselves our question: what are we willing to die for? And we're dying for values. So let's live on our feet, as opposed to submitting and capitulating to an ease. Please, let's learn together. Let's contend with our disagreements. Reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll try to do my best. Look out for one another, protect one another. All we have is one another. But let's make a difference now. We owe it to ourselves a different world, because we are in a state of urgency and emergency. And if I may conclude, I'll say this. Our species is living in unparalleled times because of 3 reasons. Number one, the fact that we've come to, again, engage in this schizophrenic act of dabbling and sharing endless atrocities, like I said, on phones, endless archives of death, of mass death, right? From Syria, the butcher of Damascus, to otherwise, right? That's constantly recurring. And that doesn't mean that I wanted to feed into some imperialist conquest of Syria either, as much as Bashar is the butcher of Damascus, right? Number 2 is the fact that we have developed means and weapons of mass destructions that Hiroshima's, Nagasaki's could be incepted in an instant, a moment. And it doesn't take an order from somebody up above as much as a disgruntled soldier who's sleeping at the wheel down below. Number 3, our Mother Earth, who has her own timetable and schedule. She does not distinguish between an indigenous land defender and a freedom fighter, or a Zionist, or a white supremacist. And that doesn't make her any less rational or reasonable. It's just that we imposed our rationality and our reasoning upon her. But she needs to do what she needs to do in terms of cleansing herself, giving the raping, the pillaging that we've engaged in. So I'll leave it at that. And again, I'm very grateful to you, your patience, your audience, and this opportunity, Jared. So yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to be in conversation as well. There are a few things. Um, so Quaker Anarchist, who's a good frequent listener, had a few questions, but I'm gonna pull in. Let's see. This is a good one. So the question is, if Palestine has grown to a liberation zeitgeist, how can we interweave in the genocides in Sudan, in Congo, Haiti, and the U.S., meaning, settler genocide here as well?
Thank you. Look, there is consciously and unconsciously, and this is the problem of a 48 and 1917 narrative, that Palestine has become constructed as an exception. And this is what a 1492 narrative helps to situate. What is going on in Sudan, what is going on in Congo. It's about the interrelational, symbiotic big picture. We're not fighting just an Israeli state. We're fighting a white supremacy and over 500 years of colonialism, imperialism. And again, not to romanticize what existed before that. We need to contend with that too. But that we're dealing with machinas that actually plan not just decades, hundreds of years in advance. And we're failing because there is no left, because we tear each other apart for all the reasons that I noted. The right, they all, and liberals ultimately, align themselves in certain degrees and in certain respects. So to answer the question, interrelationality of struggle, the framework then becomes important insofar as the story that we're trying to tell. I try to tell a story. Whether I succeeded or whether I failed, whether I partially did this or that, that's irrelevant. But I tried to tell a story of 1492 here and in my work, and a few others have tried. And this is how we're able to interweave the Congo, Sudan, atrocities. Again, Kashmir, it's all over. The Uyghur, the Rohingya, its various different manifestations, global Islamophobia, anti-Blackness within, again, Arab and Muslim communities. And this is how we don't construct a Palestine exception, and how we actually beautify of Palestine when we say that she's going to unravel us all, she's going to free us all. Well, but that depends on, again, the prefigurative impositions that we apply to her. Are we really listening to what Palestine has to teach us of all the unravelings going back to 1492 or just to 17 or 48? So that's how I would answer that question. And again, from a movement perspective, because the key that I try to do and in this book is not only political theology, but to contend with our movements. I am a movement organizer. And I learn from movements because they are the world of the below. Of course, there's the meso, there's the macro world of the above. The meso, the institutions, Columbia, Sinai Hospital, whatever, that we're all a part of. And then there's the macro geopolitics. But I've tried to focus on the world of the below, right? In relationship to the world of the above, and what the world of the below needs to do. So I hope that, that helps in answering that question and not constructing sort of a Palestine zeitgeist or exception. So.
Appreciate that. I think you addressed this a little bit in, through your discussion around slavery and also anti-Blackness. But there's also, I saw a couple comments on this, and I did want to just give you space to respond to of, the history of Arab or Muslim, colonization or enslavement within Africa, and how that fits for you within the things you're seeking to unravel.
I appreciate that question a great deal. I do think that there's an Orientalist, I think there are Orientalist dimensions to that question. Again, and I'm not exonerating Arabs here. Arabs have committed a lot of problematic things and atrocities. But it also feeds into this conceptualization that even, Afro-Pan-Islamists have noted, although I disagree with them, and so on, insofar as Islam being spread by the sword. First of all, Arabs were not in charge throughout Muslim history. I mean, can we look at the Ottoman Empire? There's a lot of dimensions of this that are worthy of unraveling. right? Without feeding or without escaping, the fact of what Arab supremacy has done, of anti-blackness that I had sat down and discussed. But then we sit down and we need to read, Muslim and non-Muslim historians on this, and there's a lot that has written upon this, and because I actually address this question, right? And it's sort of like, again, feeds into, oh, are you Arabs or slave traders no different than the Europeans? I think that's a discombobulation of history there. That, again, I'm not denying that Arabs have made a lot of mistakes historically. They made it while they were still within the context of sort of the Arabian Peninsula, right? But the nature is very different, and we have to understand what it is that we're talking about then, ostensibly speaking, right? Because, like I said, I think in so many different ways, while atrocities have been committed, the majority of how Islam spread was actually in intertwinement and engagement with the cultures in various different places in the world. This is why we see different manifestations. I mean, how many hundreds of years were Muslims in India? Is India a Muslim country? It isn't, right? So again, this is not to say one way or another that to remove sort of that Muslims committed to this or that, but also acknowledge that there's a difference. There's a difference between European colonization and the institutionalization and its purpose in 1492, and relegating sort of anybody who's the other as savage, as heathen, as godless, a particular racialized, indignant knowledge, a religious sort of casting upon the other, and what happened with European conquest. That becomes different. Slavery existed within Jewish societies. Does that mean the same as white societies? This is what necessitates disentangling and importance, and I think I address facets of that so in the book. So
Appreciated. So this was another question. I don't know if you're familiar with this work, but wanted to know if you could speak at all about your work compared with the work of Palestinian Quaker, Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique by Professor Saeed Atshan. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
yes, I am familiar with Saeed's work, although I think it came out more recently, so I didn't address it in my PhD. I think I'm contending again. I think it's, in terms of Saeed, my work is not a memoir, right? I'm dealing with movements, and I'm dealing with scholarship, and I'm dealing with areas and fields of studies while trying to be interdisciplinary. And I'm dealing with the context of, like I said, sort of settler colonialism here, right? And I think that sort of, again, it's a wonderful body of work. It's a wonderful sort of, he's done a wonderful job. But I think, like I said, mine is perhaps a different natured one. It's, my work doesn't drift or isn't a memoir, right? So, there's much that can be said in that respect, but, for the sake of time, I'll just perhaps leave it at that, because I think a lot of queer Muslim, queer Arab scholarship, queer Palestinian struggles along various different fronts. And again, this is going now beyond Saeed. It struggles from the fact that a lot of queer Muslim literature is disconnected from queer studies entirely. So it's not even in conversation with queer Indigenous or queer Black studies, neither in citation nor in actual engagement. And the same thing with Muslim feminists, right? It's disconnected from settler-colonialism, broader discussions of that. It's confined within the hijab, then not the hijab, within divorce laws. And, do Muslim women get more rights out of Islamic paradigms of divorce, or court systems in the US without engaging sort of settler colonialism and so on. So, but this is why interdisciplinarity becomes really important when we're talking about Indigenous studies, insofar as transnational notions of indigeneity, and indigeneity being an analytic, right, not a racial ethnic construct. When we're talking about Black studies and intersections that should be discussed insofar as Blackness and Islam, given what I said with regards to 1492, and how one can't really analyze race without religion because of how they were both twin arcs of Euro-American conquest. They were both mobilized. So if you're just analyzing one and leaving out the other, then there's a problem in the analysis. You're failing to see the big picture, and so on and so forth, right? So that's what I would just say, generally and specifically speaking, with Saeed's work, and just on the question.
Thank you. I'm going to give you one more and then we'll get you out of here. I appreciate all your time. So again, from Quaker Anarchist, but I imagine this will allow you to close on a nice note. So can you speak on your comment about, quote, making rhizomes, not roots, and quote, the grass is the only way out. I love this so much.
Thank you. I was told by somebody who used to be an elder. He was a leftist, and then after that, he became a liberal. George Ishaq, actually, who passed away, and he was one of the founders of the Kifaya movement that actually was anti-Mubarak in 2005. And I remember sitting in his office, and we got into a bit of let's call it a disagreement, not a heated discussion. It was a passionate one that he perceived that what I was saying was too leftist, if you will, and uncompromising in terms of his values, which I don't think that should be an issue, right? But I remember when I was sitting down and sharing with him my experience in Tahrir, and just the death that I had seen of children, of somebody that was sniped not even a meter away from me, and contending with that healing that I'm still dealing with till now, that he said, for new grass to grow, that some of the old must die. For new grass to grow, some of the old must die. Death is a part of life. And we must become like rhizomes, as in we must become like networks. There's no way that we'll be able to honor our martyrs everywhere. Not Hind, not Wadia, not Brianna, not Michael Brown, not George, without embodying what did our siblings die for? Did they die for tote bags? Did they die for some kind of assimilationist or the secular democratic project? What was the full embodiment of their dreams? If we're to create life, we need to understand that. If we're to allow room for a different world, a pluriverse worlds, a world of the below that includes a world of many worlds together, we must act upon that. We must understand what we're fighting against and what we're fighting for, what we are fighting for. And that's what becomes the key that way. So don't get fixated, on the grass. Grow, become conjunctive ants, mature, evolve. Any revolutionary movement that does not push the emblem of its own being, of its own becoming. We are not single issue causes. It essentially crystallizes, stagnates. We look at what we did. We're amazing. We created a new world. The 18 days of Tahrir, the Black Spring. Okay, and where's Black liberation and all this? Where's Tahrir now? Where's Occupy? Occupy, right? Where's No Dakota? Where are the investments? Where's the alternatives? And that's what I'm keen on seeing through. That's the birth of different worlds. So no, we don't get fixated. We grow, we become networks, we become rhizomes, and that's in our everyday encounter. You are, and you have agency the moment that you walk into a grocery store, talk to a grocery clerk, a worker, a homeless person, to build, to expand, to become, not just simply to be, to walk with the land, like I said, and not walk on it. So, and to listen to her. So yeah, and I'll conclude that, and to, again, act locally, think globally, as my elder Gustavo Esteva passed away during COVID had long noted. There is no free Palestine without a liberated Turtle Island and without a liberated Africa. So let's make it happen within our lifetimes, but that's more than just rhetoric,
Agreed. It certainly is more than just a rhetorical call. I appreciate you for taking this time with us today, with our audience, with my questions. And of course, again, I want to just reiterate to folks, there is a link in the show description that is from Pluto Press that contains actions that people can take in support of you, as well as Jodi Dean, another professor who has been, facing repression from, I believe it's Hobart and Williams schools. And so anyway, thank you again for your time, Dr. Mohamed Abdou. It's been great to be in conversation with you.
Please just call me Mohammed, Jared. I'm not going to take my my titles with me to the grave, but I appreciate you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm deeply humbled that to finally meet you. Thank you so much to the listeners, and please forgive me for my shortcomings. So, and if I misspoke in any way, so I'm grateful for you all, and I learned from you all, and it's a genuine honor.
Yeah, thank you. The pleasure is ours.